Hey guys, good afternoon. Thank you for joining me today on this quick little video. I just thought it was interesting and it's something I want to share with you guys, more specifically because I've heard questions that people ask me about the Old Testament and why do they say that you can't fully trust the regular version of the Old Testament. And when I say regular, what I mean is the usual version of the Old Testament that is rendered in Bibles such as like any common American Bible where it's the Masoretic text. It is the text that is used. It's the Hebrew translation of the Bible. And the reason I say you can't trust that is because it has been changed, it has been edited. The whole idea of the law and Moses in the Old Testament sense has been changed, and it is different than the idea that we have. Um, so why am I saying all this? I mean, we have some proof of this happening, specifically when we're talking about like so there's the Masoretic text, right? But actually, before we go into all that, I'm gonna pull up this picture because this is the whole reason I want to give you this quick video because there's this picture that I thought was interesting that helps relate to that. And of course, it's not opening. Okay. Oh, well, here it is. So it is the history of the two Hebrew languages. So let's zoom that in here. So, what does it mean by the two Hebrew languages? So, basically, there's a lot of stuff here, and I'm going to try to quickly break it down. But there's basically the original Paleo Hebrew, which was the language of Moses. It was a Phoenician language that Moses spoke. And then there is a Masoretic Hebrew, which was created later, much after Jesus, around the 600s, where it was a Hebrew that was recreated out of other languages. And why are there two? So basically, Hebrew, Paleo Hebrew, the original, was basically dead for um, hundreds of years. So as we see here, real quick, we see that Paleo Hebrew dies around the year 550. And why is that? Well, as we know in our Bibles, the Jews have been taken over and captive by the Babylonians. Jerusalem is sacked and the temple is destroyed, and the Jews are sent to Babylon and the tribes are dispersed. So that is the basic idea. You can go ahead and read the Old Testament and figure out more details of that. But so basically, that original language that the original Old Testament, the original law, specifically the words of Moses, the law of Moses, Exodus, everything was written in that Paleo Hebrew, which was then lost when the temple was burnt and everything, and then the language basically ceased to exist. Why? Because they now live in Babylon. Most Jews were transported to Babylon and beyond. And basically, the language of Babylon was Aramaic. So, what happens is that while they are in Babylonian captivity, excuse me, while they're in Babylonian captivity, we have Ezra and 13 scribes, and they, like it says, it translates the Paleo Hebrew that they had into the Babylonian Aramaic language, which is called the Quaternum Decim. I'm not sure how you pronounce it really, but it's definitely interesting. You can look up more into this. As you see, is something about Ezra was how he translated the scriptures in from that Paleo Hebrew into the Aramaic, which is the language that was thus spoken by the Israelites from then on. So for this entire period, we have the Jews, the not the Jews, but the Israelites, the Hebrews, they are speaking now Aramaic, and they're speaking Aramaic for quite a while because the new Hebrew has not yet been invented. So the Jews abandoned Paleo Hebrew in favor of the Babylonian language of Aramaic. And as you see, it was a couple hundred years where they only spoke Aramaic, which, of course, culturally was the closest to that ancient time of the Paleo Hebrew scriptures, which were the original. So then we get to Greeks invading, and we have that become the universal language of the Greeks. So the Greek culture spreads worldwide, and everyone then speaks Greek as a common language, just like how nowadays English is the common language of the world. And then Aramaic is mostly limited to Judea because it was the Jewish language, and they mostly spoke that at that time. That was the common tongue, where Hebrew was dead for, I mean, how long? Hundreds of years, if at that point. So the Aramaic is mostly stuck in Judea. So what happens then? Europe and Rome adopts the classical Latin around the 100s, second century. They start adopting Latin as the lingua franca, or the language of the common, language of the people. So by this point of the Greek culture, what we see is that once Ezra makes this into Aramaic, and this is what the community of Israelites are using, and Jews are using, then it becomes, they then translate that into the Greek tongue after the Greek tongue becomes the common land. So what we have is the Septuagint being came out in the roughly, what is that, 3rd century BC, which was a direct translation of the Babylonian Aramaic, which was a translation of the Paleo Hebrew. Oops, sorry. Where was I at? So what we have is that that's a direct translation. So it makes it the oldest and most accurate surviving translation that's still used. It was translated by tradition. It says that it was translated by like 70 or 72 scribes or something like that from each tribe. And it was perfectly translated, and they did it all in separate places. And it was the same translation. It was perfect. So it was considered divine. And it's interesting because in the Bible, Jesus and the apostles use this and quote this, and they're actually like word for word. And it's interesting if you ever notice when you have a New Testament quote and you see Jesus quoting someone or Paul quoting something in the New Testament, sometimes, depending on what it is, it looks different than if you use your Masoretic text. And what is that? Why is that look different when Jesus is quoting it? It's still kind of, sometimes it sounds the same, but sometimes it's different. Sometimes it's different in big ways. So, um, we have that this is a faithful tradition, or so we can trace, of the original Paleo Hebrew intention, because of course we're getting translations of translations, so of course some translations still will be more accurate because they're from better sources. So now we start to get into the first century, second century uh, after Christ, and the Greek Septuagint is the one that's used by most Christians and church fathers and everything like that. And of course, at this time there begins new translations of the Hebrew in the Greek, because the Jewish religious leaders, I don't know how to say it, but the Jewish leaders, um, they began to not use the Septuagint, even though it was faithful back then, because now the Jesus communities were using this Septuagint to be like, look, this was prophesied in the scriptures that he was going to come, and this and that. So at this point, we see that the Proto Masoretic starts to become a thing. And what is that? What does the Proto Masoretic mean? So basically, it means that the Aramaic language was mixed, and if with other languages, I'm pretty sure it was with like Arab, it was with some other like uh German languages at the time and stuff like that, like Proto-German or whatever they would technically be called. And it changed some key things in those scriptures when they made that change. And of course, this was by the Jewish people who did not believe in Jesus. So these were not believers. Um, these were unbelieving Jews. And then, so things like the ages in Genesis 5 and 11 I believe they add 1,000 years to the histories of Genesis, and interestingly, they do it in a way that makes Shem living at the same time as Abraham, I believe. So they change the ages in the beginning, and then Aquila ends up writing a Greek Old Testament that is not accurate to what the Septuagint was claiming. Now, on the other hand, we have Origen of Alexandria, a great Christian writer, and excuse me, and he claims that the Septuagint is corrupt, and he invents the Hecaplar, which is a crazy work of ingenuity. Like, this is why Origen is, I think, the best Christian teacher in all of Christian history. But he basically makes a translation of the Old Testament scriptures in like Latin and Greek, in the Hebrew of the time, and then was it something else? I can't remember right now, but that's four different Old Testaments, and he wrote that by hand. That is insane. But then we have Jerome, who writes who writes a new Old Testament translation in Latin, which we call the Vulgate, but now it has some Jewish changes, some Judaized changes into the text. And what do I mean by that? That's a whole separate video. I have a video on that actually, if you guys want to check it out, and I'm sure you can find others. But basically, the Judaizers ended up making their way through the Proto-Orthodox Church, which is exactly where Jerome was centered in, and when it eventually came to Catholic Church. And then those Judaizing doctrines and traditions were put into the scriptures and made their way into the Latin, which is one of the earliest sources we have of the New Testament scriptures. And then after we have the in 600 AD, we have where the Masoretic Old Testament that we know of as now is switched. And this is a whole thing, you can go into it. I'm just going to breeze through it. But the Masoretic text was a Kabbalistic Hebrew created by certain gematria and Kabbalah, um, like Jewish mysticism. The Masoretic text was changed, and verses relating to the prophecies of Jesus were made different to not make it as obvious that it was things about Jesus, and obscuring it, which is why you see some of these verses, when you look at them, they're a little bit weird. It put new names for God, such as like Yahweh, Adonai, Elohim, and other different epithets or names of God when those weren't necessarily there. And then, of course, before this time, you can also look into this more, but there was a lot of magic and occult stuff that was related to them in certain sects. And there was a lot of Kabbalah magic and numerology and all this type of stuff. And that was kind of integrated into the actual language of the scripture. So it was kind of some kind of Jewish mystical interpretation that was added into it. And then eventually, after 1000 AD, we get to Yiddish. That's the Yiddish language after the Jewish people have been exiled and kicked out of Jerusalem and Judea, and they've been wandering upon Europe and upon all those places, and they have now mixed, and they have Aramaic language, which was their common language, where that old Hebrew was dead, which eventually they remade the new Hebrew, but they still spoke Aramaic, especially the common people. And then eventually it started mixing with the Germans when they moved in there, and Yiddish became the first like major Jewish language after Aramaic was the common language and all that, and then Yiddish was the common language and not like Hebrew, which would stay as a um, religious language. And then it was spoken modern Hebrew, not invented until the late 1800s by a Zionist named Eliezer ben Yehuda, and you can look that up. Where again, the modern Hebrew, like the Hebrew that you can learn right now at any school, that Hebrew was not invented until later, where it was. I'm not quite sure the complete history of it. You can look this up, and it's verifiable. But either way, that's an interesting look into the timeline of the Hebrew languages. That is why I personally believe that the Greek Septuagint is the best translation of the scriptures we have. Of course, we don't have any Aramaic translations like that. But the Septuagint is the most faithful. It's the one that the apostles and Jesus himself used, and I think it's the most faithful rendition of the ideas that were circulating in that world, and not necessarily from a Jewish perspective, but a more Gentile perspective, which makes even more sense for Gentile Christians to use the Septuagint as opposed to the later Masoretic, which was heavily Jewish influenced by unbelievers. So it's just a quick note, something that was interesting that this thing caught my eye, and I think it is a very useful tool to understanding the entire idea of the Old Testament, the New Testament, how they relate, and why exactly that Old Testament is there. Um, but anyways, thank you guys for joining me in this little video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you thought any of this is cool. If you did, comment down below. Let me know what you think. And yeah, thank you guys. Till the next video. Take care.